Russian forces have spent much of the past 6 months trying to capture the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, the focus of the longest battle and some of the most intense fighting of the war. And as the first anniversary of the invasion approaches, it appears the Kremlin has ramped up efforts in the offensive after months of setbacks. Late on Tuesday, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky described the situation on the front line as extremely difficult. It is literally a battle for every metre of Ukrainian land, he said. Well, my next guest was recently embedded with Ukrainian troops on the front line in Bakhmut. David Patrick Arakos is contributing editor at Unheard and author of War in 140 Characters, How Social Media is Reshaping Conflict in the 21st Century. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning.
I was reading some of your striking descriptions of Bakhmut, saying that it resembles the bottom of the ocean, tangled vehicles like metal crustaceans hugging the seabed, silent witnesses to it all. Will you give us more detail on what you saw and what that place looks like now?
Well, Bakhmut, as you know, was said just before you started talking in your segment, is the longest battle of the war so far. I mean, Bakhmut itself is almost totally destroyed. It's pretty much empty, save for a few elderly people. You know, when I ask them, why don't you leave? They say, well, where will I go? I mean, if I die, I'll die here. So it's completely destroyed, essentially. 1 or 2 buildings are remaining. And it is, you know, it's pretty awful. Shelling is constant. It's very close to you. It's very loud. We went just about 200 to 300 meters from the Russian positions. They were down a couple of roads in another part of the city. I mean, it's kind of the Ukraine war in microcosm to me, because not only is there so much death and destruction, but Bakhmut itself isn't actually a very strategically important town. It's essentially being, you know, closed in upon for a symbolic victory for so Putin can try and claim that his vow to liberate all of the Donbass has been achieved. So all of these people, all of the destruction for the mad dreams of what is a modern day Tsar.
So then, in terms of how that battle is playing out, and you bore witness to this, shelling is happening, but there's also urban warfare going on too.
Yes, absolutely. Look, when I was embedded with the Ukrainian Special Forces, and the commander there said, in the end, we think this will grind to a halt. It will end up going street by street by street. And that seems to be what is happening. As President Zelensky said, you know, we're fighting, or the Ukrainians are fighting for every meter of Ukrainian land. And that's what's happening in Bakhmut. And that's what's happening in towns across and cities across the east and south of Ukraine.
So tell me a little bit about what life was like for you and for the troops. What did you witness in terms of their day-to-day existence?
Well, I I can't speak too much about the base in terms of its location, but it's obviously underground. It's sort of swathed in concrete to protect from, you know, the obvious shelling and so on and so forth. I mean, the morale remains high. You know, it's very basic. My bed was a door on a concrete floor with some bedding on it, surrounded by weaponry, but they have a chess set there where I was. You know, people play the guitar. I mean, it's very, very tough. But as with all things on the front, it's that we're in war. It's that combination of intense fear and, I guess, you know, action and long days and long periods of normality, as much as you can get in that situation.
So they're living in difficult conditions, because we hear a lot about how under-resourced the Russian troops are. It sounds like the basic living conditions are pretty rough for the Ukrainian soldiers as well.
Yes, I mean, look, that's an extreme case, right? Because they're right on the front. But look, I mean, when I was in the Donbass in the spring, a soldier, you know, he said, look at me. The only thing the government gave me are my gun and its bullets. Everything else, my uniform, my shoes, their boots, has been crowdfunded. So, yes, they are incredibly under-resourced. You know, they don't have enough for the basics. And they are, of course, heavily reliant on the incoming, you know, Western weaponry. Without that, the war would be over.
And you saw some of that, did you? The weaponry in the basement?
Yes, I slept next to a javelin in its case. You know, there was in the corner of room in Enlaw that Britain has been sending over. Yeah, it was all around. And, you know, the soldiers sleep with their guns. So you sleep amongst weaponry, amongst anti-tank launchers, amongst all kinds of stuff. And, you know, even the food we ate was provided by local volunteers. It was a very nice meal we had of, you know, various cold dishes and some very nice soup, but all provided by volunteers.
So where is that cooked? How does that work logistically?
Well, what will happen is that volunteers, and that's civilians, you know, just mucking in for the war effort, will cook it in a nearby city, and the soldiers will go and get it. Obviously, they won't come to where the soldiers are. The soldiers will go and get it, load it into a van or a Land Cruiser or something, and bring it back to the base.
And is there a typical day?
I don't, not in Bakhmut. I mean, it honestly depends on what the enemy is doing. But, what they'll do, this was special forces. So what they do is they go and they attack the Russian positions. So they'll be on the base. They'll work out what's happening, right on the front. And they're not going to tell me what their actual actions are. But as special forces, sent to attack the Russian positions, it will be on base, going out on missions, coming back and, rotating. And that's pretty constant because the battle there is pretty constant.
And some of the soldiers that you spend time with, they have been fighting, they have been in service, haven't they, since 2014, since Crimea happened?
Yeah, a lot of them have. Yeah, a lot of them have. I mean, it's been, pretty relentless. A lot of people think the war began on February the 24th. It did not. It began 9 years ago, as you correctly say, when Russian troops walked into Crimea and stole it from Ukraine.
So how are they still going? How do they still have the wherewithal to continue?
Well, it's a very good question, and I've asked this many times. And actually, in the end, and especially look, as an Irish person, it's their homeland, right? It's existential for them, and they all know what's coming to them with Bushehr and the emergence of the mass graves and the torches. It's their homeland; they have nowhere else to go, so they'll keep fighting until there's no other option left.
So the local,
what choice do they have?
Yeah, well, and we hear that so many times from Ukrainians when we speak to them here on the programme.
Yeah.
Bakhmut, though, what is the outlook there? What's going to happen? You describe this wasteland over the city that was once home to 70,000 people. What is going to happen?
Well, it looks like the Russians are very slowly closing in now. The last reports were that the Ukrainians have blown up a bridge into the city, so it looks like they may be getting to withdraw. I was in pretty constant contact with a lot of the people I was with, or some of the people I was with, and they haven't answered their WhatsApp for a few days. I hope they're okay, but I suspect that they're otherwise engaged. So it looks like perhaps the end is kind of near for Bakhmut. But as the commander told me, it's not a very strategic place. Their job there was to tie up Russian forces for as long as possible. And they've certainly done that, whatever happens.
We've heard a lot on this programme about the Wagner Group, these mercenary soldiers, some of them taken from Russian prisons and told that they will have their sentences commuted if they survive on the front line for 6 months. Did you see any evidence of them operating on the ground where you were?
Well, there absolutely were. And, I wrote about being taken into the control room where they showed me footage from the Ukrainian drones. And, the Wagner Group are sent to them in what the Ukrainians call meat waves, which is just waves of soldiers just sent at them who are basically mowed down, and they can't fall back because their commanders will shoot them. And, I asked, how is this possible? And they said, well, we believe they're high on drugs, which you hear a lot of. And, I was skeptical, but I went into the control room and saw the drone footage. And the guy said to me, look, it doesn't matter how experienced a soldier you are, how tough you are. If a rocket lands near you, you will flinch. You will curl into a ball. These guys did nothing. We think they're completely high. And you saw it. You saw two guys sort of staggering around what looked like a Russian army encampment. A shell lands near them and they barely react. So that seems to be the what's happening there.
But that's extraordinary what you said, that if they fall back, so if they retreat at all, they get shot by their own commander.
Well, this is the thing. But look, this is a long-standing thing that's happened in World War II with Marshal Zhukov. The NKVD would be behind them, shooting them. But this is the deal with the conscripts. There's footage of Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, going to Russian prisons and saying, the deal is, if you survive 6 months, you get a pardon, but you're probably not going to survive 6 months. He's a very brutal, unpleasant man who spent 9 years in prison, who may one day replace Putin.
And tell me, how do the Ukrainian troops then deal with this, with these people coming in who, just seem impervious to the threat of death? As you described, they're just walking blindly into this. How do you counteract that?
Actually, it's a very good question. I've got the exact answer because I asked him the exact same question. This Sana said, look, some of the new guys, they get very, very worried when they see wave after wave. The old experienced guys, they just switch their gun for a machine gun and it's fine.
They deal with it in that way.
Indeed. It's a very brutal situation.
David, what's your take, given what you've heard and what you experienced, about this potential for a new spring offensive, new impetus coming from the Kremlin? How prepared and ready is Ukraine for that? Has it already begun, as some have speculated?
Yeah, I think it has already begun. Offensives like that, it's not everything happening simultaneously. I think the offensive has begun in certain points and it will probably continue in certain points. It's clear that Russia are massing lots of soldiers in the east. In terms of the south, it depends on the weather because the east is an industrial area. It has a big network of roads and railways. The south is essentially largely agricultural land. So if there's a lot of rain, those fields are going to clog with mud, and armored vehicles aren't going to be able to move forward. But I think that the offensive has definitely begun.
Yeah, it's hard not to feel a little hopeless about the prospects of an end coming to this anytime soon. Listening to you, what's your own assessment of where it's all going?
I think it's going to last for years. It may not be at this intensity, but don't forget, it's already gone on for 9 years, and it flares up and it lowers. Putin has something, a frozen conflict that he can ignite and cool down for political capital when he sees fit. But it's not going to end anytime soon, in my opinion.
David, it's fascinating to talk to you, and I'm sure and I hope we'll speak again soon. David Patrick Arakos is contributing editor at Unheard and the author as well of.
Since the third day of the earthquake, me and my organization, most of the team passed the border from Turkey towards Jindera, Syria. We are specifically putting most of our weight in these towns around Afrin because it was one of the most impacted areas that was hit by the earthquake. I can say we sleep only a few hours per day. Day and night we are continuing our time to try to help the people with all our capacities. So far we are trying to help, but we feel always like we're disabled. We are having a very few resources, but the need is really tremendous. And you feel like you are unable or disabled to help the people. This is the most thing that actually makes us so nervous, so stressful. And this disaster that caused everyone impacted by it, loss of relatives, loss of kin, etc. It made us really overexhausted and consumed.
Joma, that sounds incredibly, incredibly difficult. And you have my condolences as well. I'm very sorry to have heard about your family too. How are you personally doing? You've spoken there about some of the bigger challenges that everyone is facing. How are you personally coping right now?
The first hours of the earthquake, I tried to save my family back in Gaziantep, Turkey. Then I put my wife and my kids near my brother's house in a safer place. They stayed in a mosque, and then they moved to a camp. And then I moved all the way here to Syria to help assist. I don't know, you feel you feel you are hypnotized. You don't feel what you feel. I don't know how to express, but the shock, it's like a resurrection day. Like the earth shake, the cracks made all of that destruction, and everyone is mourning their beloved ones. Like it's more or less a resurrection day. It's like a calamity. Everyone is walking without logically absorbing or being able to absorb what happened. So people are literally out of their mind, unconscious. That's what we are in, because till now people didn't understand the shock and the aftermath is to come.
Of course. Muaz, you're in Turkey, where obviously a huge number of people are also grappling with some of the same shock that we're hearing about there from Joma. I believe your organization is involved with distributing aid at the moment. How are the communities that you're meeting? How are people there holding up?
Well, people are amazingly resilient, first of all, because, what they have gone through, I can't imagine. I'm just looking at the post-earthquake, the locations. I was in Gaziantep. I was yesterday in Jinderis with Al Jazeera's Zaina Khudr and other Western journalists. And today I'm in Adiyaman, and I just came here from touring the city center of Adiyaman. It looks like they are in literally a war zone. They had gone through, multiple bombardments across the city, entire streets, everything is down. And I spent some time both in Syria with, victims of the earthquake that were being treated at the hospital, as well as the folks that are already internally displaced. And the ones in Syria are wondering where the world is. And they're wondering why these wide open border crossings with paved roads, wide open, just like you're driving in London or Doha or Washington, D.C., that the only line of cars going into Syria are ambulances, not ambulances that are going in to help save people. They're ambulances carrying Syrian refugees that have lost their lives in Turkey and are now going back to be buried in their homeland. But everyone I spoke with is stronger than anyone I know in the world, especially the Syrians who've suffered 12 years of the worst crimes of the 21st century at the hands of Assad, Russia, and Iran, and now dealing with an earthquake where Russia and Assad continue to block cross-border aid from the north, which is few kilometers from places like Jindaris, where Jama is and where I was yesterday.
Muaz, you've spoken about resilience here. Is there anger too? Are people really frustrated about what's happened?
Absolutely. I mean, if there is a big fire, let's say in a city in Europe or the United States, you'll see ambulances and you'll see, police and you'll see cars and things like that. You don't see anything on the borders. Like there's no aid coming in, and people are angry because not only have they been left alone to be bombarded, whether it's chemical weapons or barrel bombs and all of that by Assad, Russia, and Iran, they are now left alone by the international community and the United Nations. And people are really, really angry over the fact that the UN is asking permission of Bashar al-Assad, who blocks aid and bombs these people, in order to bring in aid from Turkey. The fact is, I don't know in the history of the United Nations that a major historic proportions earthquake that's so devastating that 9 days, a week into it, the United Nations has sent nothing. So people are rightfully angry because the world continues to abandon them 12 years on from the beginning of their revolution.
No, let me bring you in here because we've heard a number of very, very powerful words: shock, anger, resilience too, but also numbness. Presumably none of this is coming as a surprise to you.
No. And the numbing or the disassociated state is a very typical initial trauma response. For people who've not experienced trauma, maybe they've experienced the death of a loved one, and often when you experience the death of a loved one, you may go into a numbed out state initially, simply because it's not possible to process and experience the emotions, and also because there are things to be done. Your first guest described that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of trying to save lives, initially find survivors, and then sort out what's needed to maintain life and living. And you said in your introduction, getting schools up and running, and I can't tell you how important that is for children. So there literally isn't time for that stuff. There's a survival space now that people go into, and there will be other feelings. Of course, there'll be anger, there will be all sorts of very strong emotions, but that sort of numbing, unreal sense of I can't process this is very familiar, and people will come through that and then begin to process the sort of the emotional content of these things, which is pretty horrific what they're going to be processing in terms of the loss of. There's so many losses going on, and your second guest pointed out that there's been ongoing losses in Syria. So this compounds, it goes on and on and on, and becomes quite horrific. And I think one more point I would say is, I think you'll get first guest. Apologies, gentlemen, but your names didn't go into my brain. That's the way my brain is, unfortunately. So I'm going to refer to you as guests. That the first gentleman was talking about as a frontline first responder who's also having to deal with being in the event. And again, that's very typical, that the first responders also have their own losses and experiences, their own concerns about family, getting them to safety, and then have to deal with the fact that infrastructure has stopped existing. It's gone. The sorts of things that you would rely on, the ambulances, the roads, they just don't exist anymore. They're not there. And so the sort of things that you might have trained to have in place so that you can help people and save people have just disappeared. And then you're left as a professional with this sort of impotent sense of overwhelm that you can't do what you know you should be doing. And all of that sort of builds and compounds, and it's awful for people on the ground. Absolutely dreadful.
You just said the word impotence there, and that goes back to something that Joma was talking about, a sense of helplessness almost, Joma, especially this many days on after the quakes. Can you tell us a little bit, I can see the rubble there around you, how people are dealing now with search and rescue? Are people still looking for people? Is there still hope?
If you allow me, I would change my camera position to show where I'm standing here next to these heaps of rubble in the middle of one of the major streets in this town. This town used to be only 18,000 population before the war, but now it's over 110,000. So you can imagine how many IDPs already have been residing here. Unfortunately, heaps of rebels behind me, as you see, are there are still corpses and unsaved bodies inside the white helmets and other rescue search teams trying to help. But since the first, there was no gear, only shovels and small hammers that people tried to save people from under tons of cement, damaged structures, metal, roots, and etc. So you can see the scale of the damage that already people have suffered from lack of shelter, displacement, and being stiffed in northwest of Syria in a small geography. So we as aid workers, we were always hoping for making zero tents, zero camps, at least for people to have a decent shelter or dignified one to live in. But now this catastrophe, not only the crumbled houses, there are a lot of houses that are inhabitable. You see behind me, like streets of the town have like been entirely wiped out of the map. So the crisis is really great. And unfortunately, the shelter crises and other needs of the people will be increased for a longer time. So unfortunately, we feel this despair because Syria is again, the Syrian people being let down, disappointed by the really weak response. I met today a delegation from UN in Turkey who are responsible of the response in northwest of Syria, and they apologize. But this apology doesn't make anything. We understand the old bureaucracy working in. We understand the war zone Syria. Syria is not anymore, unfortunately, on the front line or front pages of the news because it's not a priority for the international community. But we have a humane feelings. We have a humanity and moral obligation for all countries to come and help. These people will be alone in the winter, in the cold, if no countries, I mean like big countries, not only small NGOs or UN here and there to come and help. The UN DAC have came to Turkey, which is the Disaster Assessment Committee, but they never visited here. There is a small local council that's only a couple of dozen of people who are managing this disaster that even countries cannot come help. Even in Turkey, there was over 80 or 70 countries that sent professional rescue teams with gears, with etc. But here, we unfortunately we were.
Joma, I hear your anger. I want to ask Muaz a little about how slow the aid response has been as well, because you spoke about the anger that you were seeing from people, especially across the border in Syria. I want to understand, is that compounding the trauma that people have already had to live through?
It's not just compounding the trauma people are living through. It is killing them. The lack of aid, the slowness of aid and the lack of aid is killing people. The fact is, people screamed the first day. They cried and wept under rubble, yelling for their loved ones who were just outside waiting for their turn at a bulldozer or an excavator driver, because nobody sent heavy machinery into Syria. Third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, until you hear the whimpering of your own family members and loved ones underneath the rubble die out. And you know now that they're dead. When you're just scrambling, whether, as Jama said, using shovels and hammers and whatever you can and helplessly, not getting anywhere, or waiting for your turn. We have a school for orphans in northern Syria called the Wisdom House, supported by American communities. And two of our former students, alongside their extended family, were in Genderis. They all died, but their relative was outside waiting for their turn at a bulldozer driver. And by the time that happened, all 9 family members were brought out dead. So the slowness of aid is killing people. And the fact that the UN, the United Nations believes that Bashar al-Assad is the Secretary General. They've given full sovereignty to him, and they're asking for his permission to open border points that he doesn't control physically in reality. And that further legitimizes him. And he waited a week. He waited more than a week. He waited for everyone to die to then say, maybe you can use another border crossing for 3 months. This is a shame on the legacy of the United Nations, and it's a shame on the legacy of European and Western, and frankly, even Arab countries that have sent planes to Damascus, a regime known to steal aid, that hasn't sent even a tiny percentage of that aid to regime-held areas that experienced some of the earthquake. But the places in Syria that were the hardest hit have received nothing. The slowness of aid is not just traumatizing them, it's literally murdering them.
Noel, I want to bring you in here again, because we're hearing about the trauma and also the physical challenges that people are having to live through right now. Obviously, there's just not a lot of places for people to sleep, not a lot of food for people to eat. How does this moment, how people deal with the aftermath, how does that contribute to how people are going to deal with processing all of what's happened going forward?
It's hugely destructive. I mean, there's a number of things that will take place. I mean, both your guests are describing superbly some of the issues that the survivors will be left with. And there's a thing called survivor's guilt, for example, which is really, really difficult thing. Why did I survive when my family didn't? There's also issues about, people trying their best and listening and failing to rescue their loved ones. And they will be left with that memory for the rest of their life, and they will be hearing those voices going on and on again, and berating themselves for not doing better. It is true, it's the world that needs to do better, not those individuals. But that doesn't help you when you're an individual who's listened to your child dying under rubble. It doesn't help you that there's a political context. And so we need to think about that individual as well. And the lack of aid does this, because one of the things that's most helpful initially in terms of helping people cope with huge events like this, disastrous events like this, and I've worked with literally thousands of people. I was worked a lot with forced migrants in the UK, people who've been through natural disasters as well as wars, etc. And there's this thing about trying to get back to some semblance of normality as quickly as possible, which is not, you can't get to normal in this situation, but what you can do is get to living a life routine. So that people are getting up, looking after their kids. It might be in a tent initially and then in some other accommodation later on. But you want that process to start as soon as possible. You want the schools to be up and running as soon as possible. Again, there might be makeshift tents to start with, but they go back to... But if you haven't got that basic level of infrastructure to begin that basic transition for the survivors to get back to life and get some sense of they're moving beyond the immediate threat into some sense of safety, that's a real problem further down the line for those people in terms of their capacity to be resilient. The word resilient was used earlier on. And yes, there's a lot of resilience going on. And resilience just means the strength of your connections to other human beings. But that will break unless we get in there and provide these basic resources to people so that they can begin to process.
Well, when you say resilient, I want to go back to Joma and Janderis, because I'm seeing so much resilience from the community there. So many people who've lost their own family members like yourself, and you're trying to help other people in your community. Let me ask you a personal question, if that's all right, Joma. Because I'm curious about what you personally would like to see. We've talked about infrastructure, schools, shelter, all of that. But in terms of your own support, in terms of feeling like you're being listened to, feeling like your family is going to be supported in the future, what are you looking for? What would you like?
The international community have deserted the Syrian people for years that have passed. Since the normal barrels that Assad regime was bombing over the people, and people ran away for safety, etc. All of these horrific things that they have lived. And that was the last thing they need, is the earthquake that destroyed the 1% of power or energy that was left for the people. And now we are overconsumed. So the need is really big. People need, in the first hand, to have a proper shelter, a decent one. Houses or prefabricated containers or any kind of decent, dignified shelter, not these tents that doesn't protect anyone, either in in heat in summer or like in cold in winter. At the same time, people need to have some normalization of life. When we speak about resilience, people already, they're saving their properties, the markets, the economy, everything is really shaking, and there is a lot of ups and downs. The lack of stability makes our life like always, you are always threatened by any kind of catastrophe, whether national or human made. So unfortunately, we are, how to say, habituated to unhabitual stuff. The abnormal is becoming normal. So this kind of agitation every Syrian is living, this must stop. International community, countries, and all actors and players should sit accountable and have their own responsibility towards these people. There are hundreds of thousands of people across a small 40 by 60 kilometer, and in Idlib alone, you have over 4.5 million people living in there. Above 70% of this population are already IDPs, who some of them we have met through our humanitarian work. For the 12th time together, they are being displaced. This is not the life that Syrians deserve. So really, like, we feel always being deserted, and the aid is being politicized. So we should, the UN and others who are like responsible for making all these efforts to go to the right place, talk to the right people, and really provide the right help in its place. Even now, if we are providing thousands of tents, it's not a durable situation. It's not a solution. It's not a permanent one. Then, like next summer, we'll have some camps being flooded in the winter, some other catastrophes destroying people, and then again we'll keep moving. This is not what we need. We need like a more kind of permanent solution. Houses, shelters.
Let me ask Muaz about that, because I know you've been dealing with some of this as well.